Have you ever wondered what it would be like to wake up in a completely unfamiliar place with no clue how you got there, only to realize your life had changed forever in a single night? Emma squinted her tired eyes as the flickering lights of the train station blinked toward her. Just one more day, she muttered to herself, dragging the weight of yet another exhausting shift on her slumped shoulders. The last night train whistled in the distance, slicing through the stillness of dawn like a promise of escape. What she didn't know was that she was about to meet a man who would change her life in ways she could have never imagined. The train screeched to a halt in front of her, metal grinding against metal, echoing through the nearly empty platform. Emma climbed the steps with shaky legs, searching for a seat where she could finally let her aching body rest. Her eyes landed on a well-dressed man in a flawless suit, sitting alone by the window. He had this aura of power and mystery that made her pause for just a second. But exhaustion won out. If you want to find out how this broke young woman found true love in the most unexpected way, make sure to subscribe, hit that like button, share with your friends, and tell us what you think in the comments. Because what happens next will move your heart in a way you never saw coming. So let's begin. Emma had lost everything in just a few months. The tiny apartment she shared with two roommates was no longer within her budget, and the bills kept piling up like dead leaves in an autumn storm. Every morning came with a fresh burden, a new worry that gnawed at her soul like a silent parasite. Her part-time job at the diner barely covered the cost of a bus pass and one meal a day. She felt like she was sinking into quicksand, struggling desperately just to keep her head above the surface of a poverty that threatened to swallow her whole. Loneliness weighed just as heavily as the lack of money. Emma had no family to lean on, no close friends to share the load she carried. Each night was a quiet war against the despair whispering in her ear that she'd never make it out of this mess. The tears she shed on her thin pillow were silent witnesses to a pain that had no end in sight. The night train had become her only escape. Among sleeping strangers and blurry landscapes flashing by, she could pretend she was heading somewhere better. She could dream that her life had direction, purpose, hope. But every time, without fail, the ride ended the same. Another morning, another uphill climb, another night of not knowing what tomorrow would bring. But that night was different. Emma carried more than just exhaustion. She carried the news that she'd be laid off next week, the final warning from her landlord that he wouldn't accept another late payment, and the sinking certainty that she was one breath away from becoming just another invisible statistic on the city's cold streets. Despair had settled in her chest like a knot tightening with every breath. What she didn't know was that the man beside her had noticed every quiet sign of her suffering. Grayson Wolfe had never really paid attention to the struggles of ordinary people. But something about the quiet strength of that young woman stirred something in him he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the way she carried herself with dignity despite the worn-out clothes, or how her eyes still held that stubborn flicker of hope, refusing to die out. The train swayed gently on the tracks, as Emma finally gave in to the lead-heavy sleep pressing down on her. Without even realizing, her head tilted sideways, resting gently on the strong shoulder of the mysterious stranger. Grayson stiffened for a second. He wasn't used to raw, unfiltered human contact, but something inside him warmed at the trust in her unconscious gesture. And that's when fate stepped in, loudly, violently. The high-pitched screech of the brakes sliced through the air like a blade. Grayson sensed danger before anyone else did. His instincts from a lifetime of high-stakes decisions kicked in fast. He shielded Emma with his body just as the impact rocked the train car. Those few chaotic seconds would change the lives of two people who came from completely different worlds. Emma would wake up in a place she never knew existed, and Grayson, he'd learned that sometimes love finds you when you're not looking, wearing the simplest clothes and carrying the purest heart. But what really happened that fateful night? How did Emma end up waking in an isolated ranch in the middle of nowhere? And why would a powerful man like Grayson Wolfe risk everything for a complete stranger? Emma Thompson had learned early on that life doesn't come with any guarantees. At 23, she carried the weight of an abandonment story that started in the crib, when her parents left her at the doorstep of an orphanage with nothing but a note explaining they couldn't raise her. She grew up behind cold walls and strict rules, clinging to the hope that one day someone would show up and take her home. That day never came. When she turned 18, They handed her a small suitcase full of secondhand clothes and a hollow promise that she'd figure it out. The next 5 years were a roller coaster of temp jobs and rented rooms in strangers' homes. Emma discovered a fierce determination buried beneath her delicate appearance, an inner strength that pushed her out of bed each morning, even when everything felt hopeless. Her hands were small but capable. She could sew, clean, cook, and handle any task thrown her way. Her smile, genuine even on the toughest days, was like sunlight breaking through the clouds, warming the hearts of those around her, though she never realized the impact she had. At the diner, Emma was known for her relentless work ethic and the way she treated every customer like family. She showed up early, stayed late, and never complained about unpaid overtime. Her co-workers admired her quietly but kept their distance, a little intimidated by her ability to find joy in the smallest things despite living with so little. She saved every penny, dreaming of the day she'd finally have a place to call her own, a tiny apartment where she could put down roots and just breathe. But nights were the hardest. That was when the loneliness hit like a weight on her chest. The painful memories of her childhood crept back in like ghosts she couldn't shake. She'd learned to cry in silence, never wanting to burden anyone with her pain. Emma had a deep fear of attachment. Everyone she'd ever loved had walked away at some point. So, she built invisible walls around her heart. Still, somewhere deep inside, she held on to the hope that one day, someone would see past the poverty and circumstances and truly see her. Emma was naturally smart, though she'd never had a real chance to explore it formally. She devoured second-hand books from thrift shops and public libraries, teaching herself about a world far beyond her limited reality. She dreamed of one day going to college, having a real career, maybe even helping other orphans like herself. But those dreams felt like stars in the night sky, beautiful to look at, but impossibly out of reach. And yet, despite everything life had thrown at her, Emma had managed to keep a rare purity of spirit. She believed in people's goodness, even after being hurt again and again. She offered help when she had little to give and never lost her ability to be moved by small acts of kindness. Her greatest strength was also her greatest vulnerability, a heart that loved without holding back, even when it risked getting broken all over again. That night on the train, Emma carried more than just physical baggage. She carried the weight of an upcoming layoff, overdue bills, and a future that loomed over her like a storm on the horizon. But she also carried something she didn't even recognize, a quiet resilience that kept her fighting when any reasonable person might have already given up. That mix of softness and strength would soon catch the eye of a man used to power, but starved for something real. The exhaustion pressing down on her shoulders that early morning wasn't just physical, it was emotional, spiritual, existential. Emma felt like she was carrying the whole world on her back, and maybe she was. Every step she took, every breath she managed, was a silent act of courage. She had no idea her life was about to veer off in a direction she never could have predicted. No idea that the man sitting next to her on that train held secrets that would change everything. And what Emma didn't know, couldn't have known, was that her quiet ability to touch lives without even trying was about to reach someone who had long since lost faith in humanity. Grayson Wolfe, a man used to seeing nothing but selfishness and lies, was about to discover that pure hearts still existed in this world, and that one of them had just fallen asleep on his shoulder, trusting him in a way no one ever had before. The week before had been particularly cruel to Emma. On Monday, she found out the diner's owner was selling the place, and the new guy had already made it clear he planned to do a full, clean sweep of the staff. Emma felt the ground shifting beneath her like quicksand, but she kept working with the same smile as always, serving coffee and sandwiches like her emotional stability wasn't falling apart inside. Every customer she helped could have been the last. Every shift felt like a quiet goodbye to a routine that, hard as it was, still gave her life some kind of meaning. The apartment she shared with 2 other girls had turned into a financial battlefield. Her roommates had started pressuring her about rent, which was 2 weeks late. Tense conversations filled the tiny kitchen, and judgmental stares followed her through the narrow hallways. Emma felt like an intruder in her own home, walking on eggshells not to disturb anyone, speaking softly so she wouldn't be noticed. The constant stress of living under the threat of eviction was eating away at her self-worth like slow, corrosive acid. Meals had become a luxury Emma could no longer afford regularly. Some days she survived on the free breakfast at the diner, and a sandwich she managed to sneak out at the end of her shift. Her clothes had started to hang loose on her frame. Her cheeks had lost their natural flush. But she hid the hunger behind forced smiles and clever excuses whenever someone asked if she was okay. Pride kept her from asking for help, and fear of being judged kept her silent about just how bad things really were. Public transportation fares had gone up, and every ride had turned into a careful math equation between necessity and survival. Emma started walking absurd distances just to save a few coins, arriving at work with aching feet and short breath. The blisters on her feet turned into calluses, and the calluses into wounds she tended alone in the cramped bathroom of her apartment. Every painful step was a physical reminder of how precarious her life had become, but also proof of her unshakable will to keep going. The small joys that once eased her loneliness had slowly started disappearing too. The fancy coffee she treated herself to once a week, the second-hand book she occasionally allowed herself to buy, the long phone call to the only friend she still talked to from the orphanage, all of it had slipped beyond her shrinking budget. Emma felt like her life was closing in, like some invisible press was squeezing every last drop of humanity and pleasure from her world. Winter was creeping in with cruel promises of bitter cold and heating bills she wouldn't be able to pay. Emma had already started sleeping in multiple layers of clothing, rationing thin blankets that barely warmed her tiny room. When she managed to sleep, her dreams were haunted by nightmares of eviction, hunger, and being left behind. She'd wake up in the middle of the night with her heart racing, a cold sweat on her forehead, and reality pounding against her chest like a relentless hammer. Every attempt to find a second job ran into the same walls: lack of formal experience, no strong references, and the cruel irony of needing money just to get to interviews that rarely turned into offers. Emma collected each rejection like an invisible scar on her heart, but she kept trying with a quiet persistence that bordered on heroic. Every no she received seemed to strengthen her in a strange and painful way. Her health had started sending warnings she deliberately ignored: persistent headaches, occasional dizziness, a fatigue that felt permanent. She chalked it all up to stress and poor sleep. She couldn't afford doctors or medicine, so she pushed through with sheer grit and the naive hope that her young body would hold out until things got better. Every morning she managed to wake up felt like a small victory over exhaustion. Every smile was a quiet rebellion against the growing despair. That night on the train, Emma carried the full weight of all those little disasters that, together, had built the perfect storm of hopelessness. What she didn't know was that she was about to cross paths with someone who'd see past the poverty and the chaos. Someone who would recognize the rare diamond hidden beneath all that hardship. The exhaustion that made her fall asleep on a stranger's shoulder wasn't just physical. It was the weariness of a soul that had fought beyond its limits, yet somehow still carried enough light to soften even the hardest of hearts. Emma had started the week with a kind of renewed determination, one that bloomed from sheer desperation, like a flower pushing its way through concrete. She woke up before sunrise on Monday, scribbled out a resume by hand on cheap paper, and hit the streets looking for any opportunity that could change her circumstances. Her legs carried her through dozens of businesses, from tiny shops to big-name stores, where she handed over her resume with a hopeful smile and carefully rehearsed words. Every door that shut in her face felt like a small death, but she kept walking, fueled by a fire inside her that refused to go out. Her search for a cheaper room took her to the city's darkest corners, where she visited rundown boarding houses and apartments that felt more like prison cells than homes. She met landlords who demanded outrageous deposits, stepped into windowless rooms that reeked of mold and neglect, and read rental contracts that felt more like traps than real offers. Each address chipped away at her hope of a quick fix, but it also strengthened her resolve not to accept anything that would strip her of her last shred of dignity. Emma's daily efforts to get small loans or advances turned into a kind of quiet humiliation she faced with her chin up and fists clenched. Banks shut her down before she even finished explaining. Loan sharks offered deals that scared her more than poverty ever had, and acquaintances looked the other way whenever she approached. Every no echoed in her mind like a hammer driving nails into the coffin of her hopes. Yet somehow, those very rejections made her even more determined to find her own way out. She tried selling the few things of value she owned: a ring she'd gotten for her birthday back at the orphanage, a few beloved books, and a doll she'd kept since childhood, the last link to her most innocent dreams. The money she scraped together barely covered a week of basic meals, and the pain of letting go of those precious memories cut deeper than the hunger ever could. Each item sold felt like giving away a piece of her story, her identity, like she was selling pieces of her soul just to survive a few more days. Reaching out to her old supervisor at the orphanage ended in a painful phone call that lasted less than 5 minutes. The woman, overwhelmed by dozens of similar cases, offered empty words of encouragement and suggestions Emma had already tried and failed. Hanging up felt like cutting the last thread that connected her to any kind of support system, leaving her floating in an ocean of loneliness and helplessness that felt endless. The extra hours she managed to squeeze in at the diner turned into a desperate race against time that left her body and mind in a state of constant exhaustion. Emma worked from dawn until long past dark, skipped meals to save money, and still saw the little cash she made vanish the moment it touched her hands. Every extra penny got swallowed up by some unexpected expense: a busted shower, a late utility bill, meds for the pounding headaches that never seemed to go away. Her strategy of saving on transportation by walking long distances came with physical consequences she hadn't fully anticipated. Her feet developed blisters that got infected from lack of care, her legs trembled by day's end, and her posture started to slump under the literal and metaphorical weight she carried. Every step became an act of pure willpower, a quiet defiance against a world that kept trying to break her. Emma had tried to keep a journal where she wrote down small wins and things to be grateful for, a trick she'd read in a self-help book she'd found in a trash pile. But slowly, the pages filled more with dried tears than hopeful words, and she eventually gave up on it altogether, realizing she was recording more losses than victories. The silence of the abandoned notebook became yet another symbol of failed efforts. All these desperate attempts to turn her life around had one thing in common: they left Emma even more vulnerable, more exhausted, closer to the edge of collapse. And it was in that exact state, utterly drained physically, emotionally, and spiritually, that she found herself on the train that night, asleep on the shoulder of a stranger, because she no longer had the strength to keep her guard up. What Emma didn't know was that this very vulnerability, this raw, unfiltered exposure of her truth, was exactly what would touch the heart of a man who'd long forgotten what it felt like to witness real purity in a world so often twisted by power and greed. When Emma woke up, it wasn't the familiar rumble of train tracks that greeted her, but the melodic song of birds she'd never heard before. Her eyes blinked open slowly, adjusting to the golden light filtering through rustic white linen curtains. The room around her radiated simplicity and warmth: wooden walls, handmade furniture, and a soft wool blanket that smelled faintly of lavender and care. For a moment, Emma thought she might be dreaming, until reality hit like a cold wave. She had no idea where she was or how she got there. The panic that surged was quickly replaced by deep confusion when Grayson walked into the room carrying a tray with steaming coffee and golden toast. He was no longer the sharp-suited man she vaguely remembered from the train. He wore faded jeans and a flannel shirt, yet his eyes still held that same intensity that had struck her. "You're safe," were the first words he spoke, his voice a mix of authority and tenderness that made Emma's heart race. She wanted to ask questions, demand answers, but something in his presence calmed her in a way she couldn't explain. Grayson explained everything: the near accident on the train, how he'd carried her unconscious to a rural hospital, and how the doctors had suggested she rest in a peaceful environment to fully recover. The ranch belonged to a childhood friend, a place he often escaped to when the chaos of corporate life became too much. He spoke with measured care, as if walking on thin ice, trying not to overwhelm her more than she already was. Emma sensed there was more beneath the surface, but the sincerity in his eyes made her decide to trust him, for now. Those first days at the ranch felt like a slow dance of hesitation and connection, two people from completely different worlds trying to find rhythm in the same space. Emma met Maria, the 60-year-old Mexican housekeeper who ran the home with steady hands and a motherly heart. The woman took to Emma instantly, cooking hearty meals, offering clean and simple clothes, and treating each emotional bruise with a kind of ancestral wisdom. "That boy needs someone like you," she whispered in Spanish, assuming Emma didn't understand. But the young woman picked up every nuance in her gentle, protective tone. There was also Jake, a 50-something ranch hand with calloused hands and an endless supply of stories about the land and its animals. He taught Emma how to care for the horses, how each one had its own personality, how they responded to patience and gentle touch. She discovered a natural bond with the animals. They seemed to sense her silent grief, seeking her out for comfort in a way even people often failed to do. Through their innocent eyes, Emma started to see beauty in a world she'd long stopped believing could be beautiful. Grayson watched from a distance, quietly mesmerized by the transformation unfolding before him. Emma blossomed in the countryside like a flower that had finally found the right soil. Her cheeks flushed with color, her eyes regained their spark, and her smile became real again. He saw her chatting with Maria in the kitchen, laughing at Jake's corny jokes in the stables, sitting on the porch watching the sunset with a kind of peace he had never known. For the first time in years, Grayson found himself wondering if power and money were truly worth the loneliness he'd chosen. Their conversation started cautiously. Emma curious about his high-powered world, Grayson fascinated by her unfiltered take on life. She talked about the books she'd read, the dreams she still carried, the tiny joys she found in simple things. He opened up about corporate pressure, the weight of responsibilities, and the constant doubt that people only came close to him for personal gain. Emma listened without judgment, offering insights that came from a pure heart. And Grayson realized it had been a long, long time since someone had spoken to him without expecting anything in return. Their connection grew through small but meaningful gestures. Grayson bringing her wildflowers from his morning walks, Emma making coffee just the way he liked it without him having to ask. They shared quiet moments on the porch, staring at stars that shone impossibly bright, far away from the city's glare. Emma showed Grayson how to find peace in simplicity. Grayson, in turn, opened her eyes to a world of possibilities she never imagined could include her. Neither of them expected what came next, that they'd begin healing wounds in each other they didn't even realize were still bleeding. Emma started to believe she was worthy of love, not despite her past, but because of who she'd become through it. And Grayson rediscovered that there's a kind of wealth in the world that can't be measured in dollars. The wealth of true connection, of a heart freely offered, of a love that grows not out of convenience, but out of the recognition of two souls that had finally found home in one another. But the question still lingered. Could this temporary paradise survive the secrets they were both still keeping? The morning started like any other at the ranch, but Emma could feel something different in the air, an electric tension that made the horses whinny nervously and the birds fly in anxious circles overhead. Grayson had gotten a phone call at dawn, and through the window, Emma watched him pacing back and forth on the porch, gesturing sharply as he spoke into the phone. When he came in for breakfast, his eyes avoided hers, and Maria whispered worried words in Spanish, words Emma was starting to understand more and more each day. The time had come to face the real world waiting just beyond the borders of their temporary refuge. It was Jake who brought the city newspaper that afternoon, his trembling hands holding the pages like they contained a bomb about to go off. The headline screamed in bold letters about the disappearance of Emma Thompson, described as a poor young woman who had mysteriously vanished from the night train. Her photo, taken years earlier at the orphanage, covered the front page, alongside sordid speculation about kidnapping, human trafficking, and the possible involvement of an unnamed businessman seen on the same train car. Emma read every word as her blood ran cold, realizing her absence had sparked a scandal that now threatened not just her own life, but Grayson's too. Grayson's phone didn't stop ringing. Panicked aides, anxious lawyers, board members demanding explanations he couldn't give without dragging Emma into the media circus now forming around her disappearance. Every call felt like a dagger in Emma's heart as she began to understand the true weight her presence carried for a public figure like Grayson. She watched him from behind the curtains, witnessing him age years in a matter of hours, his shoulders folding under the weight of a situation that had spiraled out of control. Maria tried to comfort her with kind words and tight hugs, but Emma felt like she was watching her happiness being torn apart, like a house of cards scattered by the wind. Grayson avoided being alone with her. Their conversations turned tense, filled with heavy silences and unspoken fears. The man who had come alive in the simplicity of the ranch was being pulled back into the ruthless corporate world, and Emma could see the moment in his eyes when he realized he might not be able to protect them both. The first van of reporters appeared at the edge of the dirt road like a dark omen of the chaos to come. Jake had to lock the gates and release the guard dogs, while helicopters began circling overhead, hunting for any sign of the missing young woman. Emma hid in the barn, curled up against the horses that seemed to sense her distress, tears streaming down her face as she realized that her little slice of paradise was being swallowed by a reality she had so briefly managed to escape. The world was not going to let a love story this improbable survive in peace. Grayson found her there at sunset, his eyes bloodshot with stress and exhaustion. "Emma, we need to talk," he said, and the tone of his voice carried a finality that made her heart skip a beat. He knelt beside her in the hay, his hands shaking as he held hers, and began explaining the political pressure, the federal investigations, and how his company was being threatened because of his involvement in the case. Every word felt like a disguised goodbye, a slow, painful preparation for the inevitable. "They want me to turn myself in and give a statement," he whispered, voice cracking. "And they want you to go home, to show the world you're okay." Emma felt her world collapse around her. Home had taken on a whole new meaning here at the ranch, but now she was being reminded that technically she didn't have a home to return to. The diner, the cramped apartment, the life of deprivation, it was all waiting for her like a prison she had briefly escaped. That night, a storm rolled in, echoing the emotional chaos unraveling inside the house. Emma and Grayson stayed up until the early hours of the morning, curled up together on the porch, knowing these might be their last hours, side by side. They made desperate plans, running away together, changing their names, abandoning everything to live a simple life in some distant place. But deep down, both of them knew those were the dreams of two people in love, refusing to accept that sometimes, even the purest love can't survive the weight of the world. By sunrise, the lawyers had arrived, alongside federal investigators demanding immediate answers. Emma took one last look at the ranch that had become her home, at Maria, quietly crying in the kitchen, at Jake, who couldn't meet her eyes, and at Grayson, who looked as if all the color had drained from his face. It was time to face a decision that would change both of their lives forever. Would she have the courage to fight for this improbable love? Or would she let the world tear them apart without resistance? The answer she gave in the next few minutes would define not just her future, but whether there was still hope for two hearts that had found their missing half in the most unexpected place. Emma walked through flashes and microphones as if she were stepping on broken glass. The questions sliced through the air with the same brutality as her recent memories. Were you kidnapped? Are you in love with Mr. Wolf? Did he hide you for personal gain? But she held her head high. She'd learned long ago that dignity wasn't about the clothes you wore or the address you gave. And now, under the world's unforgiving gaze, she chose to show who she really was. A whole woman, even if still in pieces. She gave the interview just as they'd asked, voice steady, posture firm, explaining she'd fainted and had been taken in by Grayson in an act of compassion, not manipulation. When she finished, the reporters looked almost disappointed that her version didn't come with scandal. But Emma knew she didn't owe the world anything, except maybe the truth she owed herself. She returned to the city wrapped in Maria's borrowed coat and a funeral-like silence in her chest. Grayson stayed behind at the ranch, battling ghosts of his own. Reality hit harder than Emma had expected. Her room at the boarding house had already been rented out, her belongings tossed into a trash bag out back. With nowhere to go, she spent the first few nights in temporary shelters curled up on makeshift mats listening to other women cry quietly in the dark. But something inside her had changed. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel completely alone. There was a name etched into her soul, a gaze that gave her strength even from far away. On the fourth day, she landed a job as a cleaning assistant in a public library. The pay was minimum wage, but the space welcomed her like a breath of fresh hope. The books smiled down at her from the shelves like old friends, ones who knew her pain but still believed in her future. Emma swept the floors and shelved books with reverence, as if handling sacred artifacts. On her breaks, She read random pages and jotted down ideas in a crumpled notebook, rekindling the dream of one day telling her own story. The routine was grueling, but Emma felt more alive with each passing day. She bought a new notebook, navy blue, where she began writing short stories inspired by the people she met. She wrote happy endings for orphaned children, lonely elders, and women the world had forgotten. Writing became her safe haven, a way to turn pain into poetry, absence into beauty. It was as if every word stitched back a torn piece of her heart. Grayson, meanwhile, fought to keep his company afloat as the scandal slowly faded from the headlines. His lawyers advised silence, his partners pushed for a temporary leave, and he agreed. But no board meeting weighed on him as much as the emptiness Emma had left behind. He tried convincing himself it was better this way, that she needed peace, freedom, a life away from his. But every night, he looked up at the starry ranch sky and wondered if she still thought of him too. Weeks later, a letter arrived, handwritten in the same soft, round handwriting he'd come to know. Emma thanked him for everything and said she was starting over. "I'm not expecting you to come find me," she wrote, "but if you ever wonder whether you made a difference and know that you saved a life." Grayson read the words like a prayer, his eyes burning as he touched the paper like it were her skin. She had left in silence, but her echo refused to fade. Emma kept growing. She was invited to write short columns for the library's community board, and soon readers were asking who the young woman was who wrote with so much soul. An elderly lady offered her a room in exchange for help around the house. For the first time, Emma had a bed of her own, a window that opened to morning light, and even a kettle that whistled when the water boiled. Every detail felt like a symbol of something reclaimed, not wealth but dignity earned through her own hands. She didn't cut ties with the ranch. She sent postcards to Maria, letters written in blue ink to Jake, always full of gratitude. She kept a picture of Grayson tucked in her notebook, a blurry photo she'd snapped when he wasn't looking, staring at the sunset with a distant, thoughtful expression. It was her way of keeping him close without intruding. She still loved him, but now she understood that real love doesn't chain you. It lifts you. On Emma's birthday, something unexpected happened. When she arrived at the library, she found an envelope with no return address. Inside was a letter. "Your story about the butterflies made me cry. The world needs your words. Keep going. G." And with it, a contract. A small publishing house was offering to release a collection of her short stories. Emma collapsed to her knees between the shelves, sobbing like someone who had finally come up for air after being underwater for too long. That gesture said everything. He still saw her, even from afar. But what Emma didn't know was that the real reunion was still ahead. And this time, there would be no secrets, no running, no silence. Only two naked truths finding each other again, like flames that refused to go out. The publishing contract was modest, but to Emma, it felt monumental. She held those pages like she was holding her own destiny between her fingers. She spent nights revising her stories under the glow of a cheap desk lamp, a cup of tea by her side, and her heart fluttering with every paragraph. For the first time, her words would cross walls. For the first time, someone besides herself believed in her talent, someone who once looked at her in a way no one ever had. But not everything came lightly. A few days after signing the contract, Emma got an unexpected call from Maria. The housekeeper's voice trembled on the line. "He's gone, Nina. Mr. Grayson. It's been days. He's not answering. Even Jake doesn't know where he is. Something's wrong." Emma's blood ran cold. The thought that Grayson might be in danger hit her like a primal force. It wasn't just longing anymore. It was urgency. She hung up without thinking twice. She had to find him. She started searching discreetly, not wanting to attract media attention. She combed through corporate news sites, looked for mentions in financial forums, but found nothing concrete. Just rumors, leave of absence due to exhaustion, internal company conflicts, speculation of a sale. It was as if Grayson had been wiped off the map. His absence wasn't just physical, it was emotional, like he'd decided to disappear from himself. Emma couldn't sleep. Night after night, she lay awake in her small bedroom, replaying every conversation, every silence heavy with unsaid things. every gesture that meant more than words. She started writing compulsively, not stories, but letters to Grayson she'd never send. Where are you? Why did you pull away? Do you still think about me the way I think about you? The pages filled with questions and longing, forming an ocean of absence that threatened to drown her all over again. Then one gray afternoon, as she was leaving the library with a bag of donated books, she got a second call. This time from a lawyer. The voice on the other end was formal, but the message was clear. Grayson Wolfe had voluntarily checked into a private clinic after a breakdown. He was in rehab out of town, cut off from everything and everyone. He doesn't want visitors, the lawyer added, but he asked us to give you something. Days later, a beige envelope arrived, sealed with wax. Inside, a single folded sheet in his unmistakable handwriting. Emma, sometimes you have to disappear to find yourself again. I'm trying to rebuild, away from the noise, away from the mask I wore for years. But know this, whatever I truly am, it began with you. Please don't forget me. Grayson's writing looked shaky, like it had been done during a moment of weakness. But the message was clear. He was still there. Lost, but trying to return. The news shook Emma in a way she couldn't explain. She'd spent months rebuilding her life, trying to heal without relying on him. But knowing that Grayson was also struggling, that he wasn't as invincible as he seemed, rekindled something inside her. She realized something that changed everything. He hadn't pushed her away out of shame for her, but out of shame for himself. And that was the key to an old wound she might be able to help heal. Maria confirmed what Emma had begun to understand. Grayson had been battling anxiety, constant nightmares, and a deep fear of repeating past mistakes, especially with Emma. He thinks he doesn't deserve you, Nina, Maria said gently. Emma cried in silence that night, not from sadness, but from finally understanding the truth. Grayson hadn't run from her. He was trying to become someone worthy of the love she had offered him. And that kind of fight was the noblest of all. Driven by an instinct she couldn't name, Emma made a choice. She wouldn't wait anymore. It didn't matter if he wanted distance. Real love, when it's true, is presence, even when it's hard. She requested time off from the library, gathered what little money she had from her book royalties, and set out on a journey with no promises. Every mile traveled was her answer to his silence. She wasn't going to save him. She was going to remind him that he was never alone. The gates of the clinic emerged through the mist of a cold morning. Emma hesitated just a second before pressing the buzzer. Her heart pounded like an old drum, heavy with memories. She didn't know what she'd say or how he'd react. She only knew one thing. She had to try. Some stories only end when the truths are spoken face to face. The receptionist smiled kindly and pointed toward a hallway. He's in the garden, waiting. But what Emma would find in that garden would change everything she thought she knew about the man she fell in love with. Because sometimes, the most anticipated reunion doesn't just reveal a face. It reveals scars, confessions, and a secret that could change everything. The clinic's garden was a quiet sanctuary, lined with low trees, mist-dampened wooden benches, and winding stone paths that meandered between clusters of flowering bushes. Emma walked slowly, her heart lodged in her throat, every step feeling less like crossing distance and more like traveling through time. And then she saw him, sitting alone beneath a nearly bare cherry tree. Her body froze. Grayson looked different, thinner, paler, but still unmistakably him. His eyes were closed, as if the whole world lived inside them. She didn't say a word. She simply walked over and sat beside him. The silence between them was thick like fog, but not uncomfortable. Grayson opened his eyes slowly, like waking from an old dream. And when he saw Emma, shock gave way to something else. Relief and pain. "You came," he whispered, his voice so faint it nearly vanished in the wind. "I didn't know if, after everything, I'm still me, Grayson," she said gently. "And you? Are you still you?" The question lingered in the air. He closed his eyes again, inhaling deeply. "I don't know," he confessed. "I've been trying to find out who I am without the suit. without the contracts, without the need to control everything. But some days, all that's left is the emptiness. Emma reached out, her hand resting on his. The touch was light, but it carried the weight of everything unspoken. Then let me stay, until you remember. He took her inside, showed her the modest room where he slept, the sketches he'd made on crumpled paper during sleepless nights. No spreadsheets, just drawings of trees, birds, and sometimes feminine faces with eyes just like hers. Emma saw herself in every line. They talked for hours, peeling back old wounds and revealing new fears. He told her about the panic he felt when she vanished from the media, the crushing guilt of not protecting her from the storm. I thought disappearing would be best, that you'd be free, at peace. She answered, eyes full of tears. I was never at peace without you. And then, the anger Emma had buried for months came pouring out. You threw me back into that world without even asking if I was ready. You acted like it was for my good, but it was fear of letting yourself be loved. I understand, Grayson, but it hurt. He didn't defend himself, he just nodded, eyes wet. It hurt me too, more than I can explain. It was a meeting of stripped-down souls, no pride, no excuses, just pain, honesty, and the aching desire to rebuild. I'm not some fairy tale woman, she said, voice trembling. I have scars, Grayson, fears. I have a past. I don't want to be rescued. I want to be chosen. He slowly stood, then dropped to one knee without warning. Then I choose you, now. No masks. No running. It wasn't a proposal. It was a surrender. Emma collapsed into his arms, and for one suspended moment, the entire world seemed to hold its breath as two hearts finally found each other again. The following days at the clinic were about rebuilding. They walked the gardens together, shared simple meals, read chapters from Emma's soon-to-be-released book. Grayson laughed again, started to see color returning to life. For the first time in years, he didn't think about mergers or stock options. He thought about surprising her with wildflowers, about making her coffee just the way she liked it. The transformation wasn't magical, it was real, slow, painful, but honest. Emma knew he still needed time, and she didn't rush him. But something shifted in that clinic. The reunion hadn't just been with her, it had been with himself. A few weeks later, Grayson asked to be discharged. He was stronger. And for the first time, he didn't go back to the city's glass towers. He moved to the small town where Emma now lived, rented a simple house near the library. He started writing, walking, learning a new way to exist. At the library's reopening event, Emma was invited to speak about her newly published collection of stories. When she walked into the hall, her eyes searched the crowd for only one face. And he was there, in the back, quiet, standing, wearing the same look that had saved her on that train months ago. When her speech ended, she walked to him and, without a word, took his hand. The applause faded, but inside, both of their worlds were screaming the same truth. There's still time. That night, as they celebrated in silence, something unexpected appeared among the gifts on the table. An unmarked envelope. Inside was a single photograph. Emma, as a little girl, at the orphanage. On the back, handwritten, "She always belonged in your world, Grayson. You were just too blind to see it." Grayson kept the envelope on his desk for days, unable to bring himself to touch it again. That photo of Emma as a child, smiling shyly in front of the orphanage's old camera, hurt more than he could ever explain. The handwriting on the back wasn't familiar, but the message was clear as midday sun. Their destinies had been intertwined long before their first encounter. This wasn't just coincidence. It was the kind of truth that forces the heart to change shape. Emma felt the transformation within herself like she'd brushed years of dust off her soul. She came home from work and found Grayson baking bread or planting daisies in the yard, smiling in quiet contentment. Sometimes they didn't even speak, just listened to the sounds of a life they were finally learning to taste. She no longer asked for promises, just presence. And he gave that to her with a silent devotion more meaningful than any vow. The library had become not just Emma's job, but her personal stronghold of healing. She received letters from readers in other towns, invitations to book fairs, and messages from young orphans who saw in her stories a hopeful mirror. She'd never imagined her pain could become healing for others. But now she understood. Shared scars build bridges, and telling her story was both an act of resistance and of love. Grayson, in turn, began supporting local community projects. He used his business experience to organize charity events, restore school libraries, and fund scholarships for underprivileged youth. No one in town treated him like a distant CEO. He was just Grayson, the man who poured coffee at town meetings and asked kids what they dreamed of becoming. He was finally living the kind of legacy that couldn't be measured in profits. At home, the changes ran even deeper. Grayson had learned to live lightly. He left notes in Emma's books, favorite chapter, or this line gave me chills. She'd laugh, sometimes cry. Together, they tended a small garden, had picnics in the park, and read poems aloud on Sunday mornings. It wasn't a fairy tale life, it was better. It was real, built brick by brick on pain, regret, and the daily choice to begin again. The room where Emma kept her manuscripts was slowly filling with shelves. And on a rainy Saturday, Grayson walked in with a gift wrapped in plain paper, a restored vintage typewriter. "So your words can travel even farther," he said. She hugged him so tightly it nearly broke the moment. But that's what they had learned to do. Turn fragility into strength, silence into bond, absence into promise. They both knew there were still shadows from the past that could return, but they no longer lived waiting for tragedy. They lived ready to face it together. Grayson started attending therapy, not out of obligation, but by choice. He said he wanted to be whole so he could love better. Emma, meanwhile, enrolled in a creative writing course at the local university. Life was beginning to align with their dreams, not by miracle, but by persistence. On the 1-year anniversary of the train accident, they visited the ranch. Maria and Jake welcomed them with tears and a table full of food. They walked through the stables, sat on the same porch where they once shared heavy silences. Only this time they laughed. Grayson showed her a box of letters he'd written but never sent. Emma read them all, one by one, her eyes brimming, and answered each with a kiss. Long, quiet, and sealing every unspoken wound between them. It was there, under the ranch's golden sunset, that Grayson pulled a small ring from his pocket. Without any fuss, he said, "I don't want you to change your name. I just want you to keep writing stories, with me in them." Emma smiled and accepted, not like someone saying yes to a proposal, but like someone saying finally to a destiny the universe had been whispering all along. It was more than love. It was redemption. In the days that followed, Emma began organizing a reading club for orphaned children. She shared her stories, offered warm hugs, and listened intently as small voices told her, "I want to be a writer too." Grayson watched from a distance, filled with pride and reverence. He knew he'd finally found the true meaning of the word home, and that home had her face, her voice, her heart, the woman who taught him how to love, with courage. But everything seemed a little too quiet. Until one afternoon, Emma received a new letter. No return address. Inside, only one sentence. That photo was just the beginning. There's more you need to know. About your past. And about ours. The new letter arrived folded inside a cream-colored envelope. No return address, bearing the same elegant, steady handwriting that echoed memories of the old photo. Emma hesitated before opening it. Grayson noticed her trembling hands and simply nodded. She opened it slowly, like someone unearthing a forgotten secret. The message was short, but heavy with meaning. That photo was only the beginning. There's more you need to know. About your past, and about ours. In the days that followed, Emma quietly launched an investigation. She revisited the orphanage, now nearly abandoned, and found a former employee who remembered a man who used to visit in the 90s. He was tall, always well-dressed. Watched you playing in the courtyard, but he never took you home. The woman recalled, her eyes foggy with memory. He looked torn, like he wanted to adopt you, but something held him back. An old scar reopened in Emma's chest. The void of a childhood without answers now filled with new questions. Meanwhile, Grayson received a call from the family lawyer. Old documents had been discovered in a safe that once belonged to his father, who had died a decade ago. There were letters, donation records, and an incomplete adoption form. The name of the child? Emma Thompson. The applicant? Richard Wolfe. His father? Grayson froze. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a bond severed by fear, silence, and choices made in the dark. Emma read each page like stolen chapters of a story she never got to claim. She discovered that Richard had tried to adopt her after an affair with a woman who died during childbirth, her biological mother. But family shame, bureaucracy, and the company's interests had buried the process. Emma was never taken home, but she was never forgotten. Grayson was not just the man she'd fallen in love with, he was also her half-brother. The world shattered. For days, silence wrapped around them. The revelation felt too cruel, too surreal to fit into the love they had built. Emma felt betrayed by life once again, while Grayson sank into guilt for not searching for the truth sooner. But it was Maria, with her quiet wisdom, who brought light. Blood doesn't define love. You weren't raised as siblings. You found each other as wounded souls who healed together. What you feel isn't sin. It's sacred. Emma needed time. She traveled alone for several weeks, speaking at public schools, listening to stories from other broken women who still believed in love. In each voice, she saw a part of herself and understood more. The love she and Grayson shared wasn't born from biology, but from choice, from recognizing each other in the dark. When she returned, she carried a quiet certainty. Some stories defy logic, yet they are real nonetheless. Grayson waited for her in the garden, where daisies had bloomed without him even noticing. When he saw her, he rose slowly, as if afraid she'd vanish. But Emma walked to him with steady steps, pulled a manuscript from her pocket, and placed it in his hands. "It's called Everything Love Didn't Know," she said softly. "It's about two strangers who found each other in the dark and lit each other up. They decided to begin again. No labels, no rush, no need to explain the unexplainable. Just two people choosing to stay." The scandal never exploded. The truth was too complex, and it remained in the privacy of a circle built on love and understanding. The library became their safe haven. Emma's stories were picked up by a national publisher. Grayson, now a social impact consultant, helped youth from broken homes build possible futures. One night, Emma reread her old diary, the one filled with unsent letters to Grayson. She ran her fingers over the smudged words and realized something that made her smile. The broken girl who had written those pages no longer existed. In her place stood a whole woman, built from loss, courage, and difficult choices. And when she looked through the window and saw Grayson asleep on the couch, one of her books resting on his chest, she knew the home she had been searching for her entire life was never a place. It was a person. Emma's story began with a lost train in the night, and it ended, or perhaps began again, with a published book, an unlikely love, and the quiet knowing that even the most twisted paths can lead to shelter. Because in the end, what saves us isn't having all the answers, it's having someone who stays while we search for them. Tell us in the comments what touched you most about this story. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more powerful narratives like this one. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video, where one story just might change everything you thought you knew about love, courage, and starting over.